Hello and welcome to the Gravel Ride podcast, where we go deep on the sport of gravel cycling through in-depth interviews with product designers, event organizers, and athletes who are pioneering the sport. I'm your host, Craig Dalton, a lifelong cyclist who discovered gravel cycling back in 2016 and made all the mistakes you don't need to make. I approach each episode as a beginner to unlock all the knowledge you need to become a great gravel cyclist. This week on the podcast, I'm actually going to be the guest. So a little while back, I was the guest on Bike Talk with Dave, with host Dave Mable. Dave reached out to me and said he's been a longtime listener of the podcast. He and I connected earlier via one of his film projects, and he mentioned that he felt like I left a bunch of Easter eggs in each episodes. Easter eggs about my history or little mentions of things that I've done in my life. And he was curious to unpeel the onion and get to know me a little bit better. And it dawned on me that so much of my time on this podcast is spent interviewing others that I rarely share that much about my history, how I found a love for the sport of cycling, how I became a podcaster, and what I do for my day job. So with Dave's permission, I'm going to republish the conversation I had on Bike Talk with Dave that was originally found on his feed, just so you can get to know me a little bit. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Again, for the frequent listener, you'll get to know me a little bit. If this is your first time listening to the Gravel Ride podcast, maybe this isn't the episode to start with, unless you want to get to know a little bit more about me. In the meantime, I did want to thank the Dynamic Cyclist. I mentioned them in the last episode as a longtime sponsor of the show at this point. Dynamic Cyclist offers a stretching and strengthening program specific to cyclists. It's a video series. Each video is about 15 to 20 minutes long. It's designed to be easy to fit into your life, something you can do in addition to all the cycling training you're doing. But it's critically important, especially as you become older, that you really do strengthen and stretch those parts of the body that get overworked. You can imagine as a cyclist, we all sit in this kind of awkward, unique position. And it's important to kind of work other muscles, as I'm learning more and more as I'm getting older. So I encourage you to check out Dynamic Cyclist. Just go to dynamiccyclist.com. They've got a free 1-week trial, so you really know what you're getting into, and very inexpensive either monthly or annual memberships. If you're a Gravel Ride podcast listener, which obviously you are because you're hearing my voice, simply enter the code THEGRAVELRIDE and you'll get 15% off either one of those programs. So I highly recommend making it part of your routine. And with that free trial, there's no reason not to try it out. So with that, I'm going to hand over the microphone to Dave Mable, who's going to interview me.
Craig Dalton, I am so thrilled to have you on Bike Talk with Dave. You are the OG of gravel podcasts, and just talking to you before this thing, I'm just having these flashbacks because I do listen to your podcast very, very regularly, and even go back to before I started listening to podcasts to hear your old episodes. But it's a treat to have you on and hear your voice in my ear yet another time today. So welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I'm appreciative of you having me and looking forward to the conversation.
I wanted to have you on because, well, you've got a cool podcast and you've done some cool things, but you throw out these little teasers about your past history, your past life, and you've just piqued my curiosity, to be perfectly honest. And I'm like, I just got to ask this dude, like, who he is and how he came to be. So, first of all, where are you right now?
So I am in Northern California in the town of Mill Valley. So we're right at the base of Mount Tam, which is purportedly the birthplace of mountain biking.
No doubt. Do you have an old mountain bike?
I do. I've despite the Gravel Ride podcast being my main public persona in cycling, I am an avid mountain biker and have been for a very long time.
So I asked you if you had an old mountain bike. What's your oldest mountain bike?
My oldest mountain bike is probably 12 years old.
Oh, all right. That's getting old.
So not exceptionally old. And if I had enough room, I probably would have had a few more laying around. I do have access to one 25-year-old Dean Titanium mountain bike
Ooh.
that is with my father right now. And the long-term vision is that'll come back into my life. And hopefully that'll be a bike my now 8-year-old son can grow into at some point.
Oh, that's pretty cool. You better hang on to that. That's very cool.
Yeah, it's got a, in addition to being like a neat titanium bicycle from that era, I actually, and we can get into this later, I worked at Dean Titanium. That was my first sort of professional job out of college.
Oh, cool. Oh, I do want to get into that because that's one of the things you throw out are little tidbits about you working in the cycling industry and being a lifetime cyclist. I feel like cycling often leads us to cycling industry jobs. So am I guessing right that cycling came first in your life?
Yeah, it did. And I'll take you on the Wayback Machine for a minute here, Dave. So both my mother and father are from England, and my dad was an avid bicycle racer before he came to the U.S. and a little bit when he set foot on U.S. soil. Always a road racer. By the time I was around, he had transitioned into marathon running because having kids wasn't allowing him enough time to ride.
I can relate to that.
The bike has always been sort of around my life, but I certainly didn't pick it up with great interest. I did a little bit of BMX racing, which my father thought was completely crazy and uninteresting. He thought that was a discipline of cycling he didn't understand. And thankfully, my neighbors raced BMX and they would take me because my parents really had little interest in fostering my BMX career.
Did your dad ever use the word silly? I'm just picturing an English guy. What are you doing with that silly sport?
Exactly. I mean, I think his progression from cycling, as he would describe it, is first he had a truck bike. So I translate that to being like, beach cruiser, kind of city bike style, and then fell in love. And, in the UK, they have a lot of cycling clubs that are fostering interest for the kids. So, by the time they're 10 or 12, if they're showing interest, they're getting offered bicycles to use on the weekends and really kind of fostering them and developing them. In fact, my father is one of 5 boys, and I think 4 out of the 5 boys all raced as kind of teenagers into their early 20s. And it's been a unifying thread for the entire family, just the sport of cycling. In fact, my cousin from Australia, originally from the UK, is staying with me right now, and he and I reconnected as an adults via Facebook as a platform and our love of cycling. And we ended up going and riding in Belgium together.
Oh, wow.
But I completely digress. My progression, again, BMX, kind of then just used the bike for getting to and from school. My freshman year of high school, my dad took us on a bike tour. It was 3 of us freshmen in high school and him up through upstate New York and Vermont. We were living in New Jersey at the time. But it was still not something I was craving to do, riding a bike. It was just something, it was a great activity and a lot of fun. It wasn't until my freshman year of college and after my freshman year of college, my dad had bought a mountain bike. And this is to date me, that would be sort of around 1986, 1985 timeframe. So pretty early on, he bought a Cannondale mountain bike. And while I was home for the summer, I fell in love with it. And I decided I really wanted to get a mountain bike. I was in school in Washington, D.C., got a job in a bike shop to bring that cost of entry down, and ended up buying a Trek 7000 aluminum hardtail and started cutting my teeth mountain biking in Washington, D.C. For the uninitiated, Washington, D.C., believe it or not, has a lot of dirt trails. You have to figure out how they're all interconnected, and it's certainly not like being in Iowa or Colorado where there's a lot of open space to kind of pursue these things. But it was there, and it was quite a fun community. So started racing mountain bikes kind of my junior and senior year and falling in love with it. It coincided with me falling out of love with being a university student. And fortunately, maybe, I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, I said to myself, if I can get a degree in business, I can apply that to anything. And in order to finish this degree, my intention is going to be to go work in the bike industry.
Oh, cool. Wow, that's pretty intentional. Did you end up getting the degree?
I did. Yeah, I finished my degree and I was managing a bike shop in Washington, D.C. And I said to myself, I was also bike racing mountain bikes at that time and being fairly competitive at the expert level in the mid-Atlantic region. And I decided, well, if I'm just managing a bike shop, I can do that anywhere. Why don't I move to Colorado? And at the same time, I was applying to bike companies via, gosh, snail mail probably at that point, and
Right, licking
telephone.
a stamp.
Yeah, and I remember I had got some interest from Dean Titanium and Yeti. They both had potential positions available, and I said that's enough. And I packed up all my stuff, moved to Colorado, went down to interview at Yeti. That didn't work out. Moved to Boulder, got a job in a bike shop, connected with the team at Dean, and they brought me in for an interview about a month after I arrived, and that led to me becoming national sales manager of Dean Titanium.
Wow, cool. That's
That
pretty.
title would imply some lofty position and experience,
It
but
does.
at that time, it was that meant I answered the phone and tried to convince bike shops and customers to buy bikes.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So, what bike shop in Boulder and what year?
I worked for Cycle Logic,
Okay.
and that would have been 1993.
Huh. Okay, cool.
And yeah, it was a pretty brief stint actually at the shop before I ended up moving over to Dean.
Yeah, I had a little history with bike shops in Boulder. A friend of mine was part of the Morgul Bismarck crew, and then ended up that closed, and there was another Cycle Works, or I don't know. Anyway,
There's so many great bike shops there in Boulder.
so many great bike shops there in Boulder, and so much great riding there in Boulder. I spent a summer in Boulder, and I mean, we still love to go back with our road bikes, believe it or not, and do some of those roads, either up into the mountains or out into the plains, like some of those rides out towards Niwot and Longmont, and I don't know, just go east were
Yeah.
awesome. I
Yeah.
loved it
Yeah,
out
for
there.
sure.
So, how long were you at Dean?
I was at Dean for about a year and a half. And then I took a break and was focusing a little bit more on racing, which I was still doing. Turns out working for a small bike company doesn't actually give you a lot of time to ride and train on your bike. So I took a break and got some menial job and raced. And then I got an opportunity to move out to California to race for a team that was sponsored by Voodoo Bicycles and Wheelsmith. And I had made a friend who was out in Palo Alto and got me a place to live out here. So I moved out to race for that team, and I was able to get a job with a bicycle computer and accessory manufacturing company called Avocet.
Awesome. I should have gotten them, but I probably have three old Avocet computers in my garage in some old box somewhere.
I would love to see them.
Avocet. I'm thinking of the wrong thing. Who made the Fat Boy? Was that Avocet? Did they make tires?
No, that wasn't. They did. Yeah, they did have a very popular slick tire. Their computers were had numbers associated with them. So the Avocet 20, the
Yeah,
Avocet
yep,
30, and the
yep.
Avocet 45. And then one of the big innovations that happened while I was there was the Avocet Vertex. And the Vertex was the first digital watch that could track elevation gain and loss.
I remember that.
And it was really, I mean, the older listeners will understand this moment. At that time, when you were talking to your buddies about a mountain bike ride, and the only piece of data you had was mileage, it was really difficult to compare one ride to another, right? So you could say, I
Yep.
rode 10 miles, but if you did 10 miles and 5,000 feet of climbing, that's a lot different experience than 10 miles and 1,000 feet of climbing.
Right.
So the Vertec became this great unlock that we all take for granted today. Like when you go to a course profile for an event, they're always talking about mileage and elevation gain that you're going to experience. But prior to that point, it just wasn't available as a data set for the average consumer.
Yeah, it was a big deal. Wasn't it barometric pressure based?
That's exactly it. Yep.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting and pretty kind of vague. I mean, it's certainly not an exact science. Like,
Yep. Yeah, and it drifted, right? The barometric pressure would
right.
drift, and there you'd have to reset your elevation to a known elevation. in order
Yep.
to get it to work.
Yep. I remember those days. I never had one, but I do remember that. I did have the Avocet 20, Avocet 30, whatever they got up to. 40?
I think there was
there a
definitely
40?
a 40, and I can't remember if there was a 45. There was one that actually had that Vertex technology into it.
Oh, yeah.
That might have been the Avocet 50, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, you might be
But my
right.
experience there was great. I ended up going to work on the national mountain bike circuit. So I would go to all the events and kind of represent Avocet and have an opportunity to do a little riding myself. I was able to go over to the Tour de France once and represent Avocet. At that time, I mean, the thing that I always come back to with Avocet, they used to have these ads in the bicycle magazines where they would show the front of the professional peloton, and every one of those riders had an Avocet computer on their bike. And my favorite tagline was, "What 90% of the workforce brings to work."
That's awesome.
And
I
to
can
me,
picture that
like,
ad.
yeah, I was so sold. So I was one of those guys who went over and made sure everybody was dialed when the Onse changed from their traditional yellow to their Tour de France pink. We gave them all custom pink computers.
Nice, nice. That's awesome. What a fun experience. What a great, if you're a cycling enthusiast, what a great gig.
Yeah, I mean, the bike industry, as you know, like it has its ups and downs. I do think, as a young person in their 20s, it's a phenomenal place to work. It's just, you have to start questioning your career path later in life. Like, where am I going to get to? Obviously, the bike industry is fairly small. There's some exceptions, but a lot of these businesses, unless you're the owner, it's kind of hard to really move up the food chain.
Yep. And time is like, if you want to have a family, it's hard to be
Yeah.
at the
Yeah.
Tour de France for a month every year, and then the Tour of Spain, and then the Tour of California, and then the et cetera, and then you go to Interbike, and then you go to the outdoor retailer show, and
Yeah.
you can be gone from home a lot. So it is a
Yeah.
lifestyle for sure. But
to
romantic.
that exact end, I ended up accepting a position with one of Avocet's competitors, Veta, and I moved over to Switzerland to be
wow.
European. I was European sales and marketing manager, and effectively they had a person in the position who was usurping too much power, as according to the U.S. bosses, and they wanted someone young who they could control, who was willing to live in Europe, travel around country to country, and represent the company. And I was like, "That's
I'll
me."
go.
I raised my hand. I'll go. I had a great time. The company was in the course of my brief tenure over there, which was only about 6 months. The company was bought by a private equity firm, and I had some issues getting paid, but I had a great experience for 6 months over in Europe, living on someone else's dime.
Yeah, no
Again,
doubt.
just talking about bikes with people. But I will say, after that experience, I was like, I need to take a professional break from the biking industry and go find something else to do. I'll still love riding my bike. In fact, I may even like it more if I don't have to talk about it, 50 hours a week.
There's truth to that statement for sure. So what'd you end up doing? I mean, that's still a while ago.
Yeah. So, I guess the sort of abbreviated version is moved back to California, ended up going to business school and studying technology management. Worked for a series of small companies in the mobile industry. And then in 2010, I founded a company that made iPad and iPhone accessories, a company called Dodo Case. And it ended up taking off. I won't belabor this since this isn't an entrepreneurship show, but ended up building a manufacturing facility in San Francisco. Our products were handmade. I 100% reference back to my early experience at Dean Titanium in terms of how to build a brand, how to build an aura, how to build quality products, how to stand behind those products, and really kind of take and accept consumer input as like the guiding principle of where you take the business. It was in the early days of social media. Being here in the Bay Area, we sort of understood the game that needed to be played at that time, and we amassed a pretty big following because we just had a great, compelling story. I mean, who's hand building phone and iPad accessories in the United States.
Yeah, nobody.
Exactly. So obviously cycling continued to be part of my life, but it was just a recreational activity. I wasn't doing much. I don't think I was attending any, I wasn't going down to Sea Otter. Like I let most things come and go. Maybe I would pin a number on here and there. I sort of went out to Leadville and did the Leadville 100.
Oh, cool.
I had a brief stint doing Ironman triathlons, but it was all just in the, the pursuit of fun and scratching that endurance athletics itch.
Do you remember what year you did Leadville?
It would have been either 2007 or 2009.
I'm going to have to look. We were in that era, so we might have lined up together.
Amazing.
You were probably ahead of us, but nonetheless. I think my first was like 03 or 04. I did it solo. And then I told my wife, I was like, hey, I think this is tandemable. And she believed me. Actually, she said, if we get a new tandem, I'll do it. I'm like, I'm calling the bike shop right now. We ordered a tandem, and she said yes.
I can't imagine going up Columbine nor down Columbine on a tandem.
Up Columbine was a lot of pushing, as you can well imagine. And down Columbine, we bought a Ventana full suspension rig with the Maverick fork, so 6 inches of travel front and rear.
Awesome.
And I needed all 6 inches. Like,
I bet
you're going down Columbine, and there's people coming up on the other side of the trail, and there's a giant rock in front of you. All you can do is hit it, And so I did, but we always made it down. The only time we crashed was going up the power line, and it's just rocky and hard. And I come around a corner, and the front wheel just gets up on a lip and then hits another rock and just stops all of our momentum. And for some reason, we leaned to the right, and there was nothing but air below our feet, and so down we went. A friend of ours was with us at that moment, and he looked at us. He's like, "You guys good?" "Yeah, we're all right." He's like, "I'm out of here."
Goodbye. It's already been long. If you're on your way back up power line, it's already been long enough of a day. You can't, you can't wait for downed soldiers at that point.
No, that's true. That's true. We made it home though. So you have a lot of mountain biking in your history. Where did gravel come in?
Yeah, so the story around gravel, I had moved from San Francisco to Mill Valley, where I live today, and I was riding into the city. And for those of you who don't know the geography here, there's actually a lot of, there's the coastal range of hills that kind of go right from the Golden Gate Bridge into Marin County. So you can actually ride in on the dirt. And so I had this new commute, and I'm going to mention that this was also when I discovered listening to podcasts, and we'll put a pin in that statement for a minute here. But I was riding into the city, and I had an opportunity to ride on the dirt or ride on the trail. And I had a cyclocross bike back in the day, and I was like, would have been around 2015 timeframe, just to give a timestamp there. So I bought a Niner aluminum gravel bike with a max tire capacity, I think, of maybe 33 millimeters. And I started riding that, and it had mechanical disc brakes. And I started riding that into the city and listening to my podcasts. And I thought, well, this is sort of an enjoyable hybrid of, it's a drop bar bike, so it's efficient. So when I get on the pavement, I can ride to my office, it was about an hour and 15-minute trip one way, with probably 60% of that being on pavement. So again, like playing in that mixed terrain angle. But I also started to recognize, one, that I was enjoying it, but two, that the bike didn't have the capabilities that I needed. The hills were steep, so my mechanical disc brakes were requiring too much hand strength to brake. And it felt like a huge shortcoming only having 33 millimeter tires around here. Disclosure, the gravel riding we have around here is rough, and many people would argue that it's mountain biking, but it's my cup of tea. But again, so I thought, like, how was I around the sport of cycling my entire life, as we've just discussed? How did I botch this bike purchase and buy something that wasn't suitable? And, I was reading about the gravel market. It was obviously early days at that point in terms of like the amount of models that were out there, et cetera. And I decided like, I want to go all in on this. Like, this is the type of riding I really like. I want to get the best bike that I can afford. I want disc brakes and I want big tire capacity. So after a bunch of research,
I think that's called a mountain bike.
Possibly. A bunch of research, I ended up selling a road bike and pushing all in on an open up with 2 wheel sets. So I had a road wheel set and a gravel wheel set, and I absolutely fell in love with it.
What was the tire capacity of that?
I could run 47s.
Oh, wow.
650 by 47.
Huh. Wow.
That.
That's pretty early. I mean, those are, if you're talking 15, 16, like, we're still riding cross bikes on gravel those days. I mean, you go buy a cross bike and that's your gravel bike.
Unquestionably, that open bike was visionary and ahead of its time.
Yeah.
I would still argue that its spec still holds up with the sweet spot of gravel cycling today.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah.
So I feel like you dove in head first.
I did.
And you're going all over the freaking world riding a gravel bike.
Yeah, so I pushed all in. I realized, like, one, I had a caliper brake road bike, and I was like, this thing's going to be worthless a few years from now as people go to disc brakes. So I was like, I just need to clear out the garage, take the money I get from that, sell the Niner, and buy this one bike. For me, the type of road riding I do, I found that the Open totally capable as a road bike with, 28C tires on 700C wheel sets. And then, as I said, with those 650B 47s, incredible bike for everything we have in front of us here on Mount Tam. At around the same time, now this is going to 2017, we ended up selling Dodo Case, the business I had started. And I had mentioned as a little something we put a pin in that I'd been listening to a bunch of podcasts. Dodo Case was a manufacturing business. It was also an e-commerce business and a social media business. So I was always in front of a computer, building websites, trying to convert e-commerce customers to customers. And I said to myself, I need to do something totally different for a break. And selling the company gave me, I don't have to get a job tomorrow money. It did not give me, I don't have to get a job ever money.
Fair enough.
But, it gave me a little bit of a window to just kind of explore my own creativity. So I said, I'm enjoying podcasts. I'm flabbergasted that I managed to screw up this gravel bike purchase. There's so much going on in gravel. I get so many questions about how to spec a bike. I said, why don't I took a podcasting course and I began the Gravel Ride podcast in 2018 with this simple vision of I was going to interview people, product designers, and event organizers.
Which I feel like you've stuck to for going on 5 years now.
Yeah, it's been pretty much the journey. And as you and I both as podcasters, there's days where you're like, can I keep up the energy and enthusiasm to do this? Obviously, being conversational podcasts like we both host, it's important that you're engaged and excited to talk to your guest. And I still am. I mean, I do think, as we hit 2023, some of the massive innovation in the bicycle design maybe is behind us for gravel.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There was a long journey of many years for designers to figuring out like, well, how do we get the right tire capacity? How do we get the right geometry? And I don't think there's not one single right answer to that. I think what has emerged is you've got this great category that as riders explore their own interests, as they reconcile their own terrain, there's the right bike for you. And yep. I'm always the first to say the bike setup I have here is not the bike setup for Kansas, for example. Like it's just, it would be way overkill. And there's nothing wrong with what I've set up my bike as, and there's nothing wrong with how you've set up your bike.
Yeah, well, You would totally make fun of me. I'm still on uh, this is kind of interesting, a Trek Crockett, the pink one,
Yeah.
and flat bar, which is interesting. And it is signed by both Gary Fisher and Katie Compton, which
Wow.
I don't know, maybe that went down in value a couple years ago, but I feel like it still has value. I'm a Katie Compton fan. But it was kind of funny because it was at the Trek CX Cup. And truth be told, I wanted Sven Ness to sign it. And every time, as a journalist, every time he was available, I was working. And if I wasn't working, he was working, coaching, doing whatever.
Yeah.
So I walked past the Katie Compton compound, and I was like, "Hey, you should sign my bike." She did. Gary Fisher walks by at that moment. He's like, "Well, how come she gets to sign it?" I'm like, "Dude, here's a pen right here." And then they argue about who had more input into its design, which I just stood back, listened, and enjoyed. But it's a pretty old. I mean, it's a cross bike. It's a
Yeah.
high performance cross bike, and it is a bit sketchy on loose gravel, but when the gravel is concrete, it is awesome. It flies. I have 33 millimeter tires on it, which people are like, I didn't know they still made those. Well, yeah, I saved them. But looking at the 47s, holy moly, those are big. I could envision a pair of 40s. I could envision the benefit of a longer bike. Talking to a guy about fat biking recently. He builds his own bikes. You'll want to tune in to Steve McGuire and hear how he has come up with his fat bike design. It is long, like really long chain stays, because it acts like a keel in the loose gravel. And I'm like, oh, that really makes sense. So there is kind of something for everyone. I also have to say, like, I talked to a dude, the podcast I dropped today, the guy is, the reason he loves gravel is nobody cares what you're riding. Nobody cares what you're wearing. Nobody cares how fast you are. They don't care what color your skin is. They don't care how you talk. Like, it's just a gravel ride.
Yeah.
And he really appreciates that. So, boy,
Yeah,
that was a rant, wasn't it?
Yeah, a little bit, but we learned a lot about your bike.
Like
No,
I said, there's
seriously,
little Easter eggs we can throw out in these podcasts, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think that the sport of gravel's in an interesting place right now, just in terms of like for lack of a better term, the professionalization of the front end of the pack and that's impact on the rest of the field. I mean, obviously, like we talk about the spirit of gravel and the type of experience that anybody who's willing to sign up for one of these events should have. Like we're not at the front. We're really just there for the experience. But there is this ongoing kind of evolution of what the front end of the pack looks like, and actually, the requirements for safety and competitiveness that need to be figured out. I'm sort of optimistic that there's a lot of experimentation going on this year. Unbound just announced that they're going to start the professional men by themselves, and then the professional women 2 minutes after that, and then the rest of the field 8 minutes after that, which I think is interesting. I do think, in talking to female athletes, it's always been this curious race dynamic of clearly you're working with men and other women throughout the day, like anybody would, right? No one wants to ride by themselves. But so much of that can come into play with who takes the win, right? If you,
for sure,
you could, a strong woman could go off the front and someone drafting men could bridge that gap, putting in, 20% less effort. And that could be the difference between winning and losing. And I have no idea what the right answer is, but I do like this idea that they're going to have some time to themselves to kind of strategically do one thing or the other. And who knows what those things will be.
Right. And at least have the opportunity to see where people are relative to themselves. Like, oh, there's 5 women ahead of me and there's 25 behind me. and then the men come and you get mixed in there, you still know, like, okay, there's still 5 women ahead of me and 25 behind me, and so I'm in good shape.
Yeah.
As opposed to just
Yeah.
not having any idea where the rest of the women are, because you lose
Yeah.
them in the melee.
Exactly. So I know the Shasta gravel hugger, which I just did an episode with him a few weeks back. Ben, he's trying a few things that'll be interesting to see. We'll see the results of that in March. Yeah, I just think it's going to be an interesting year for sure.
It is going to be an interesting year, and it was an interesting year, especially with the UCI World Championships. And that was definitely an interesting, I wouldn't call that U.S. style gravel.
Yeah.
Women raced on a completely different day than the men.
Yeah, totally not at all U.S. style gravel. In fact, I just had the gentleman on. I haven't released the podcast yet. Who's running the UCI Worlds qualifier out of Fayetteville for the second year in a row. The name of the event is escaping me. It'll come to me in a minute, I'm sure. But it was interesting talking to him both on the podcast and offline about, the expectation, I guess, at the USA cycling level for a long period of time was that this first inaugural UCI, World Championships was going to be held in the U.S. And I think UCI just wasn't communicating really well with USA Cycling. And ultimately, it wasn't until like the very sort of last quarter of the year that they really figured out and leaned in like, hey, if we're going to pull this off, it needs to be in Italy. It needs to be somewhere where they've run events and it's close to home and they can kind of, I think they just felt like that was the only way that they could execute.
Huh, interesting. USA Cycling, I feel like it was just interesting who showed up, how they showed up, and then how the race went. And I feel like it was a Sepp Kuss kind of day versus or Keegan Swenson for sure. I mean, he probably could have.
Yeah.
But it was such a road race. It was like Paris-Roubaix with gravel sections.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously like shorter than we're accustomed to. I'm not necessarily opposed to like that shorter length because I do think there's an argument to be said to say, it's hard to be racing after 200 miles, whereas everybody's racing hardcore after 100. I don't know what the right answer is, but I'm like, my gut tells me like those ultra distance ones are like their own special thing.
Yeah.
While I just pulled it up. So it's the Highland Gravel Classic in Fayetteville put on by Bruce Dunn at All Sports Productions. He's got the UCI qualifier for this year in Fayetteville again. And I think the interesting thing is, who's going to show up? Like, what is the process? He and I were talking about, as an age grouper, I could go to Fayetteville, and if I'm in the top 25% of my category, I could go compete in the World Championships.
Right.
Doesn't mean anything sort of my relative ability here in the United States across, any of these big races we have here. But I have to say that's a compelling story. Like
it's intriguing.
I would go to Italy and represent the United States. I'm a tourist cyclist, but to like have that honor of in the 50 plus category to go over there, I wouldn't, snub my nose at it.
Yeah, for sure. I'd jump at that chance. I've got a lot of work to do to even hope for top 25% of our group.
You and me both.
but nonetheless, you're right. It would be super cool. I feel like there's room for all of it. I feel like gravel cycling, an analogy is marathon or just running, road racing.
Yeah.
And anybody can sign up. You can do 5K. You can do the local 5K in your neighborhood and get a t-shirt, or you can do like the world's largest 5K in, I don't know, Boulder, Colorado. That'd be a 10K.
Yeah.
But same with marathons. And, Chicago Marathon, 30,000 people. The front lines up at the front and the mid-packers line up at their pace, and then they go run it.
Yeah.
And I feel like
100%.
gravel's pretty similar.
I do too. I think that the moment in time to build a big race, like 1,000+ person race, it's difficult to find a spot on the calendar where that'll work. today. I do think there are always going to be geographic opportunities, right? Like if there's not a lot of racing in upstate New York, there's an opportunity for someone to create a great race in upstate New York.
Yep.
It's probably also important that the economics match up, right? So if you've got if you're going to if a 200 person race is going to be the size of your race, just understand that going in and don't overinvest. And,
Right.
it's going to have a little bit more of a community feel than some of these major events that are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in their productions.
Yeah, it is kind of amazing having watched this happen. Everything from like the beginning. I was in Trans Iowa #2, and to full-time staff, full-time year-round staff, multiple
Yeah.
full-time year-round staff running these gravel events. It's kind of crazy, actually. We can dissect the world of gravel forever, but I want to know more about your podcast. You've got a co-host with Randall, and I'm curious how that works. How'd you find him, and how does it work between the two of you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Randall and I got connected. Randall Jacobs is the founder of Thesis Bike and more recently Logos Components, who's making some great carbon wheels. He and I connected because he started that business in San Francisco, and he was offering people demo rides of the bikes. And Randall was an ex-Specialized employee, helped design the original Diverge. I got to know him and appreciate his personality, his technical acumen. Ultimately, I ended up buying a Thesis bike and riding one. So I transitioned from the Open to the Thesis. The Thesis is a fraction of the price of the Open, yet incredibly capable. In fact, for anybody on video, it's the pink bike right behind me is my Thesis bicycle.
Nice. I love that pink bike.
But very much like the Open. Anyway, so he and I just became friends and became people. We rode together. We saw many elements of the industry and the world similarly. I also recognized that Randall became my go-to guy for technical questions. And it started out, first did an episode about Thesis bikes and got to know him a little bit. And then I invited him to do a Gravel Bike 101 episode. So in kind of quizzing the community what they were looking for, I realized, a lot of time the starting point of our discussions on the podcast are a little bit more advanced. I'll make the point that I absolutely endeavor to start at the beginning and try not to make too many assumptions. And I'm not trying to be a tech podcast at all. But I brought Randall on, and he and I were able to have a discussion of, what do you look for when you buy a bike? Let's break it down. Let's help the listener understand at the time in which we recorded the first one, what should you be thinking about? We did the same thing a year later because I felt like the industry kept changing, and it was just this great thing to have in the podcast feed, 2019 Gravel Bike 101 episode. As he and I continued to communicate, it became clear like there were probably some themes, some discussions, etc., with people in the industry that he was going to be a better person to interview them with. So Randall's episodes tend to either be more highly technical than mine. So, for example, he did a great episode with Matt from Enduro Bearings, where they really kind of dug into ceramic and stainless steel bearings and the viscosities of oil and stuff that's kind of, I can I'm smart enough to be, it sounds somewhat intelligent about, but I definitely don't know everything those guys and girls know. So I set him loose on that. And then the other big thing he's super keen on is just community and the community of cycling and frankly, the mental health value of cycling as an activity and the cycling community as something that, we benefit from not only physiologically as athletes, but also emotionally in that it does become this release for us when we get out there. And it's one of the things that's always attracted me about riding off-road is that, you ride a technical section and you just stop and you wait for the next guy or girl to come through and high five them, whether they crash or clean it. It's the best feeling in the world.
No doubt. No doubt. It really is. You mentioned community, and you've started a thing called the Ridership. Uh, Tell our listeners what it is and why'd you start it? What is
Yeah,
it
the
for?
riders the ridership's a free global cycling community. It has a sort of orientation towards gravel and adventure cyclists, but honestly, everybody's welcome. It serves two purposes. One, I definitely wanted to have a easier back channel to me as a podcast host. I wanted people to be able to chat with me directly, and but I also realized like I'm potentially a authority in the world of gravel cycling, but I'm not the authority.
Fair
And
enough.
to my earlier comments about, my technical shortcomings, I realized that, I had this amazing community of listeners that are very capable of interacting with one another, and they have hundreds of different experiences than my own, or Randall's for that matter. So we basically built a community on Slack, and that may not be the going forward platform, but Slack, for those who don't know, it's just a program or an application you can get on your computer or phone, and we can sort of segment the conversations into what are called channels. So we have a channel on tires, we have a channel on nutrition, and we also have regional channels. And the vision was, as gravel cyclists, when you're a road cyclist, to me, it seemed easy to find routes. Like I could go, and there wasn't a lot of questions. Like as long as I knew the mileage and maybe the elevation gain or loss, like I kind of knew what I was going to be pedaling on. But gravel, I felt like you miss the real gems. Like it's easy for me to tell you to go up Old Railroad grade and come down here on Mount Tam, but I've got 20 different, little paths that I can take you on that are gonna create those high five moments, and we all do. And so if I go to Iowa, I want someone in Iowa to tell me where I should go gravel ride. And I want to ask questions of them. If I go to Europe, I want to ask questions of someone who lives in the country that I'm visiting. So we started out with that basic premise that everybody's welcome. We've created this open platform that's free to use. It's devoid of any advertising. I originally had like a Facebook group for the podcast, and it's like, I don't want to bring you into Facebook to have other ads shoved in your face. I want you to get out on your damn bike.
Right.
So we wanted something that was like, come talk about bikes to your heart's content, then put it away. We're not looking to be part of the attention economy. I'm not trying to monetize your attention. We're just trying to create this community where we can share and exchange value.
Is it working?
Yeah, it is. We've got a pretty passionate group in there. There's probably, I haven't checked lately, but probably around 2,000 people that participate in the forum. The channel, every day you go in, the channels are lighting up from, people having a mechanical question that they're getting someone more technical to answer. Or we tend to get a bunch of like event organizers who get in the mix there saying, hey, Shasta Gravel Huggers coming up. If you have any questions, I'm Ben, I'm the promoter. Just, I'm happy, I'm here to answer, things like that. And then, a lot of direct messaging, people sell stuff there too, when they're getting rid of a bike or a wheel set or what have you. So yeah, I would say it's working. It's not my day job. So, I believe we've created a thoughtful structure. We haven't had any issues that we've needed to police. Everybody is self-selecting as someone who's just there for information and the enjoyment of the sport.
There are no rules in gravel, but one of the rules is don't be a dick. So maybe you have people who abide by the rules and are not dicks.
That's pretty much it. And for anybody who's listening, it's just go to the www.theridership.com and you'll get a free invite to join.
Perfect. I love it. So I want to ask a couple of podcast questions. Who is the guest that you were most surprised said yes?
I'll answer this in two ways. I think Rebecca Rush was that guest. And the second part of that is she could not be a nicer person.
Correct. That is a true statement.
Unbelievably engaging, inquisitive, generous with her time. Like that's the one I point to that I just one, super stoked that she came on, and two, super stoked to see that she shows up in a podcast interview as much as she does on her social media.
Yeah, that's cool. That's kind of fun. What was a surprising moment for you with a guest?
Gosh, there's sort of tricky moments, I think, in any podcast interview. Sometimes, I don't do a lot of like pre-show interviewing because it's conversational. Like, I just generally want it to happen. I've had a few guests who weren't as verbose as I would like them to be.
Or
Obviously,
you have to pull those words out of their mouth.
Exactly. I mean, we're obviously an audio medium, and we need people to talk, and we need people to tell stories. And
right,
I wouldn't invite someone on who I didn't think had an amazing story. I've just had a few odd occasions where they weren't good at telling their own story.
Yeah, I can relate to that, and only 50 some in, but yeah, you are right about that. What's your vision? Where do you want it to go?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned earlier, like I still am excited to pull the mic in front of me and have these conversations. If I wasn't, I wouldn't keep doing it. It scratches an itch for me, as we said earlier. Like, I've been around bikes and bike racing my entire life, and I do enjoy having a foothold in this world. And the Gravel Ride podcast has provided me opportunity to build an audience and build a community and build relationships within the bicycle industry. I'm fortunate enough that I've got a handful of sponsors that'll come in and help me pay for some of the overhead of the podcast. And on a rare occasion, give me an opportunity to go to an event or attend something that otherwise might be difficult to get into. And that to me was in my mind when I started the podcast, that was the reward I was looking for. Since I'm going to be involved in this sport anyway, having little perks here and there and opportunities because of the hours and hours of effort that I put into this podcast seemed like a fair reward.
Yeah. I actually had somebody ask me today, is this your full-time gig?
Yeah.
So Craig, is this your full-time gig?
You don't really understand the economics if you're asking that question.
You're right. No,
now
I did not win the Powerball $1.1 billion thing? I did not win that.
Right.
Mega
and if you think about
whatever.
It, you mentioned when we were offline about some recent interviews we've been doing with cycling media journalists and, with outside laying off a bunch of staff and a bunch of publications kind of grappling with what the future of media is. I've always felt very blessed in the fact that the podcast has never had to provide income for my family. It has never had to put food on the table because that's complicated. I mean, the economics don't really work out well this could not be a full-time position for me. And I'm certainly empathetic to the plight of people who have dedicated their lives to become proper journalists and who are struggling to sort of make ends meet in this current environment.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. I actually was editor of an actual paper magazine that was printed on real life paper, and you sat on the toilet and read it.
Love it.
And I feel like I am a Cartwright in 1912 when people are starting to buy the Ford Model A or whatever, and I'm seeing the writing on the wall that in a few years there will be no more Cartwrights.
Yeah. I think it's a super difficult transition because the obvious answer is consumers should pay for the content that they consume, whether it's audio or the written word. But frankly, even if there's a willingness to do that, the mechanisms to do so are still kludgy and create, minor hurdles for people to get over, right? Do I want to get out my credit card to read a particular article that I, became exposed to? No. But if it was like embedded into my web page, like into my web browser, like this micro transaction that could be made simple, like I would do that. So I'm stuck in that, like, there are definitely content channels that I pay for, but there are certainly other bits of content that I enjoy consuming that like the mechanisms for paying for them, just the friction's just too much for me to do so. And you as podcasters, we see this all the time, right? We occupy this very intimate place with the listener, right? They spend an hour a week with us. And if you think about like that attention that we're fortunate enough to garner from our listeners, that's a massive amount of attention. People know a lot about me from the years of podcasting and myself on the mic, yet it's very difficult for anybody to figure out how to compensate me for their appreciation of my words.
Right. They could buy you a coffee.
Yeah, indeed. Yes. That's
Absolutely.
I appreciate the plug, Dave. I mean, I've always had this sort of super modest buy me a coffee account, buymeacoffee.com/the gravel ride. And I mean, I'm always like super appreciative if someone takes a moment and does that, because it's not first and foremost. It's sort of like something I do mention, but I don't push it. And I don't have a really elaborate Patreon program that allows you to get bonus episodes. And if I had more time, I would love to do that, because I would 100% like to provide more value for those people who are supporting me.
Yeah, I send my supporters a sticker. So it's something. But you're right. It's a treat to get an email that says, hey, somebody bought you a coffee. Like, that's super nice. Because they do have to log on, and they do have to like get out their credit card and punch a bunch of things on their computer and push send, and it's time out of their day to show their appreciation for what you're doing and what you're bringing them. And you're right, an hour a week, and we're like directly like drilled into people's heads through their ears. Like that's privileged space and time, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And I will say, like, I think just to give the listener some perspective, I think for every hour we publish, probably is 3 hours of combined effort to kind of get to that hour. That's sort of my like back of the envelope math around like the effort it takes to kind of produce the podcast.
Yeah, I feel like you're more efficient than me.
Either that, Dave, or my editing is really low pro.
Oh, I don't know. You should listen to the podcast I dropped today. There was a moment where I just drew a blank in this conversation, and I said to the guy, I was like, you ever like just have a blank moment and you can't come up with whatever you're going to say? And he's like, yeah. And I was like, yeah, it sucks because I did not want to edit this, and I'm going to have to. And then as I was listening to it, as I was editing, I'm leaving that in there. Like, that's raw me. I'm leaving that in there. So I did.
Yeah, I do have to say, Dave, like I had that issue early on in the podcast where I felt like I wasn't eloquent enough, and I wanted to go in and edit everything out. Mm-hmm. And, eventually I came to the conclusion, like the effort is not worth the time, meaning like people came for this kind of raw conversation, and the fact that I may have stumbled over my words, etc., like that's just part of the conversation. And yeah, just got to go with it.
Yeah, and it's A-okay. Dan Patrick says quite a bit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Well, listen, we've been just about an hour. I really have enjoyed getting to know you face to face here. I'd love to meet you on the bike sometime, whether I make it to California, whether you make it to Iowa, or we meet somewhere in between. Do you have any big rides planned this year?
I'm still thinking about my schedule, and I probably spend too much time thinking about that. This is the offshoot, that one of those positive offshoots of like, I feel like I have the opportunity if I can afford it and get the time off from the family and work. Like, there's a ton of things that I can do. And I need to get my head around here in January, like, what are the things I really want to advocate for myself? There's a few races that I'm super keen to do. One being Rebecca's Private Idaho, The second being the Oregon Trail Gravel Grinder, the week-long stage race.
Oh, wow.
Both, super great reputations. I love the idea of multiple day events because I feel like when you travel to go do one of these events, you're taking up the time anyway. So you might as well ride and enjoy that area for multiple days versus popping in, being super anxious about a race, and then just doing that race. So I'm really trying to think about that. I had the great fortune of going to Girona with Trek Travel in November, and that was fantastic. So I'm super bullish on like just the general idea of gravel travel. So long answer to your question, definitely you'll see me at a handful of events this year, and definitely like I hope to do at least one cycling vacation type trip.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, you're welcome to come out and put your 28 millimeter road tires on and do Ragbri with us. It's a 50th anniversary of Ragbri, and I'm an old hat at Ragbri. So if you want to come out and
I love it.
Spend a week riding on the road and eating pie, drinking beer, that's about it. That's about what we do. Ride our bikes, eat pie, and drink beer.
No, I love it. I've had a couple.
I
appreciate that, Dave. I've had a couple Iowans on the podcast talking about various events there, and gosh, there's so many places to go. I would love to end up in Iowa one of these years.
Yeah, well, you've got a friendly face here, and you got my number, so look me up.
Cheers.
Yep.
Right on.
All right. Well, thanks tons, and good luck with the pod. Say hey to Randall. Tell him I enjoyed listening to his conversations as well as yours, and keep up the good work.
Yeah, I definitely will. And it was a pleasure being on the show, Dave. I appreciate what you're doing.
I appreciate that. You're a good role model for me.
Cheers. So that's going to do it for this week's conversation. Big thanks to Dave Mable for having me on Bike Talk with Dave. I hope you as a loyal listener enjoyed getting to know me a little bit better. If you have any questions about the things that I've done or want to get connected with me, I encourage you to join the Ridership. That's simply www.theridership.com. That's a free global cycling community we created to connect gravel and adventure cyclists from all around the world. So I think we'll leave it at that this week. And as always, until next time, here's to finding some dirt under your wheels.